I'm Jonathan Blitzer. I'm a reporter with the New Yorker magazine, and thanks to a grant from the Pulitzer Center on Crisis Reporting, I've done a series of stories from El Salvador. The U.S. and El Salvador have had a long and tortured relationship. When confronted with the consequences of U.S. policy in Central America, the American government tends to treat each situation as though it's in a kind of vacuum. The reporting I've been doing in El Salvador with my Pulitzer grant is about bringing the whole story into view. One of the pieces I did for the New York Review of Books has to do with the legacy of the Civil War. Between 1980 and 1992, the military government fought against leftist guerrillas. 75,000 civilians were killed in the process. The U.S. had backed the military government despite its reputation for horrific human rights abuses. The Americans learned about these abuses during the war and in some cases helped cover them up. At the center of the story I tell is a former Salvadoran colonel named Ochoa Perez. He was an American ally who was accused of involvement in two massacres in the early 1980s. The human rights group at the University of Washington, led by a professor named Angelina Godoy, worked with allies in El Salvador to get to the bottom of what had happened. My story is titled, "My Only Friend is My Conscience." I sat down with Ochoa in San Salvador and confronted him about the past. But it's not just a story about him, it's a story about what it meant that he was one of our guys in El Salvador during the war. A major consequence of the Civil War was a refugee crisis. About 2 million Salvadorans fled to the United States, this from a country of roughly 6 million people. Many of the new arrivals turned up on the streets of American inner cities, specifically Los Angeles. When they got there, life was far from easy. Many of them were brutalized by street gangs that were already operating there. And so over time, they formed gangs of their own, almost as a kind of self-defense. The gang members, though, grew increasingly violent over time and landed in prison. And after the Civil War ended in the mid-1990s, thousands of them were deported en masse back to El Salvador. A local gang problem became a transnational one. Soon these gangs spread and overran the streets of El Salvador and the neighboring countries, Guatemala, Honduras. So the second story I did with the Pulitzer Center's grant is set against this backdrop. It's the story of a man named Eddie Anzora, and it ran in the New Yorker last year. The title was Called Away. Eddie came to the U.S. when he was 3 years old, and he grew up in Los Angeles. While he was there, he witnessed firsthand how these Salvadoran gangs took root in the U.S. He was never involved in them himself, but like so many people living in the same communities and on the same streets, he learned how to negotiate the dangers they posed. When he was 19, he was pulled over for a traffic stop and found to have had drugs on him. This was the mid-1990s. Congress had just passed a law making drug possession a deportable offense. Eddie had a green card, but it was stripped from him. He fought his case for several years, then went on the lam. Eventually, though, he was arrested and deported. He was 29 years old at the time. He had spent his entire life, really, in the U.S. During the Obama years, the U.S. deported 2.5 million people. 150,000 of them were Salvadoran. Roughly 20% of them have spent at least 5 years in the U.S., so often they speak fluent, idiomatic American English. What do they do when they get back to El Salvador? It's a country they barely know. It's extremely dangerous. There's a social stigma associated with having been deported, so it's almost impossible to find work. The overall aim of these articles is to show how complex and at times tragic the relationship is between the U.S. and Central America. Our foreign policy, our immigration policy, these are life-determining events for people in the region, and I think it's important we understand the factors involved.